They were 17 years old, best friends, headed home on a Friday night after a football game. 20 minutes. That's all it should have taken. Instead, it would be 13 years before anyone found them. And when the truth finally came up from beneath the mud, it would reveal something far more sinister than anyone in this small Kentucky town could have imagined. It was one of those crisp October nights when the air carries the smell of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the whole town feels like it's waiting for something. In Millers Creek, Kentucky, that something was Friday night football. The stands were packed, the floodlights hummed against the dark, and for a few hours, everyone forgot about bills, work, and weather. You could hear the band echoing through the hills, and down near the snack stand, 4 friends lingered long after the final whistle. Evan Blake, the quiet one with the easy grin, tossed his truck keys in the air. His best friend, Josh Carnes, older by a year and always the loudest in the group, teased him about his driving. Mia Dalton, the honor student who never missed a game, laughed and tucked her hair behind her ear, while Claire Rivers, shy, artistic, and fiercely loyal, wrapped her jacket tighter against the cold. They'd grown up together, gone to the same church, same school, traveled the same back roads to parties that never made it into the town paper. That night, they were just 4 kids celebrating another home win, chasing a sense of freedom that comes only at 17. When they left the parking lot around 9:30 in the evening, Evan's blue '89 Chevrolet Blazer rumbled out behind the last of the school buses. They'd planned to take the long way home, past the diner and gas station, back into town. But somewhere between laughter and impatience, Josh suggested they take the shortcut. Locals called it Devil's Bend, an unpaved road that wound through old mining land, cutting nearly 20 minutes off the trip. Everyone in Millers Creek knew the stories about it, the washed-out bridges, the blind turns, the heavy fog that settled there every fall. It wasn't haunted. Not really. But people said the woods didn't like to give things back. Still, to 4 teenagers who'd grown up on those roads, it didn't seem like a big deal. It was a route they'd taken before, once during summer to watch fireflies over the ridge. The last confirmed sighting came from the old gas station on Route 12. The owner, a man named Ray Larkin, remembered them coming in around 9:42. He said they bought sodas, chips, and a pack of gum. They were laughing. Nothing seemed off. Evan even asked him if the road past Hollow Creek still connected to 52. Ray told him it did, as long as they didn't miss the left turn after the iron bridge. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. By midnight, when the Blakes realized Evan hadn't come home, they figured he'd stayed at Josh's. When Josh's parents called the next morning asking the same question, panic started to set in. Mia's mother drove the route twice, stopping at every curve, every turnout, shouting her daughter's name into the dark. Claire's father checked with the sheriff's office before dawn. None of the kids had shown up for their Saturday shifts or church practice. Their beds were untouched. Their phones rang endlessly in empty rooms. Every case you hear on this channel isn't just a story. It's weeks of research, cross-checking facts, verifying records, and piecing together fragments of real lives that were lost. Each episode takes us nearly 15 to 20 days of work. Long nights, quiet hours, and countless moments spent chasing the truth. We do this because these stories matter, and because somewhere out there, someone deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind these mysteries, then please take a second to subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments what part of today's case hit you the hardest. Your support isn't just a number. It's the reason we keep going. Now, let's get back to the case. By 6 o'clock that morning, the sheriff's department declared the teens missing. A dozen volunteers gathered at the high school parking lot as word spread through town. By mid-morning, the air buzzed with the sound of engines and radio chatter. Deputies mapped out a 30-mile radius around Miller's Creek, tracing every possible route from the football field to their homes. The terrain made it nearly impossible. Dense woods, narrow ravines, dozens of unmarked trails left behind by decades of mining trucks. Locals joined the search, walking through briar and mud, calling out names that echoed and died in the hollows. For days, all anyone found were tire marks that led nowhere, a crushed soda can that could have belonged to anyone, and miles of silence. Helicopters scouted from above. Dogs were brought in from Lexington, but the forest seemed to swallow every sound and scent. Then came the false leads. Someone reported seeing a blue SUV near the quarry past Route 9. But when officers arrived, it was an old Ford left to rust. Another witness swore they'd seen 4 kids walking near a rest stop outside town. Deputies chased the tip to the state line. Nothing. Every sighting faded the moment it was investigated. By Sunday night, the first vigil formed at the high school bleachers. Parents clutched each other's hands, candles trembling in the wind. Teachers cried quietly. Sheriff Howard Crane promised the families they'd keep searching until we bring them home. But as days turned into weeks, hope began to fracture. Reporters from Lexington came and went, filming the creek crossings, the empty fields, the worried faces. The story of 4 teenagers vanishing off a known road made headlines for a few days before it sank beneath newer stories. But in Miller's Creek, it didn't fade. Every parent started warning their kids not to drive alone at night. Every time headlights appeared in the fog, people stopped and stared, hoping for something, anything. The woods along Devil's Bend grew quieter that fall. Searchers said the road felt different after that, like it remembered them. Some of the volunteers swore they could still hear echoes when the wind hit just right. A faint laugh, an engine hum. But the mind plays tricks when you want answers that aren't there. Weeks later, when the official search was scaled back, Sheriff Crane stood at the top of a ridge overlooking Hollow Creek Road. Below him stretched miles of wilderness, thick and unmapped. Somewhere down there, he believed, was the Blazer. But without tracks, debris, or witnesses, it was like the earth had simply swallowed it whole. That winter, the missing posters yellowed on telephone poles. The high school yearbook left 4 pages blank in remembrance. Families learned to live with unanswered questions. But every time the wind blew through the valley, it carried that same haunting whisper. 4 kids drove into the dark and never came back. And just when the town started to quiet down, one strange detail would surface. A report from a driver passing Hollow Creek that night. He'd claimed to see faint headlights flickering between the trees, then vanishing all at once. It had been dismissed at the time, but years later, that detail would come back, forcing investigators to ask a new question. What really happened on that back road shortcut? By dawn, the following morning, Miller's Creek had turned from a quiet Appalachian town into the epicenter of a frantic search. Sheriff Harold Crane, a man who'd seen his share of missing hikers and car wrecks in the hills, was already out before sunrise. Deputies lined up maps across the hood of a patrol truck, marking every trail, every service road, every strip of pavement that might lead out of town. Helicopters from the state police circled above the ridges, their rotors echoing through the valley as if trying to shake the forest awake. From the air, the woods looked endless, green and black waves of pine and oak, swallowing the thin dirt roads below. By mid-morning, volunteers began arriving in old pickups, bringing coffee, flashlights, and hope. Parents, classmates, even strangers came ready to search. The sheriff divided them into groups: creek teams, ridge teams, and road sweepers. They trudged through knee-high brush, calling the kids' names, listening for any kind of answer that never came. Creeks were dragged with grappling hooks. Divers checked the river bend where the current ran fast and cold. Nothing. No debris, no tire marks, not a single trace of a blue Chevrolet Blazer or the 4 friends who had vanished inside it. Each hour that passed felt heavier. The forest swallowed sound, light, and time. Radios crackled with false hope. We found something, only to end in silence. At night, floodlights lit the sheriff's staging area at the Millers Creek firehouse. Inside, parents waited without sleeping. Evan's mother refused to leave, sitting near the phones in case someone called with news. Mia's father clutched her school photo so tightly it bent at the corners. Every rumor that came in, sightings on Route 9, a wreck near the quarry, kids matching their description in a nearby diner, was checked, confirmed false, and crossed out. By the 3rd day, investigators reviewed the gas station security tape again. The grainy black and white footage showed the 4 standing by the counter at exactly 9:42 in the evening. They looked relaxed, smiling, holding bottles of soda and snack bags. The timestamp was more than a number for police. It was the last known moment they were safe. The attendant, Ray Larkin, confirmed what he remembered. They'd asked if the road past Hollow Creek still connected to Route 52. He told them it did, if they didn't miss the left turn after the bridge. Then they thanked him and drove off into the night. The next customer came in 12 minutes later. By then, they were already gone. Investigators followed the direction they'd likely taken, south along Hollow Creek Road. The first 10 miles wound through farmland and then deep forest. By mile 11, the pavement gave way to gravel and then to a dirt path lined with old mining markers. It was there, late that afternoon, that deputies found something. A broken section of wooden guardrail, splintered and hanging over a steep ravine. The discovery sent a ripple through the search crews. Everyone thought the same thing. Maybe they'd gone off the road. Floodlights were hauled in. Rescue teams secured ropes and rappelled down the 200-foot drop. At the base was a swampy bog where runoff collected after heavy rain. Searchers waded knee-deep in mud, probing with poles. They found old scrap metal from abandoned mining equipment, a rusted barrel, waterlogged branches, but no vehicle. The soil was too soft to hold weight for long. If a truck had crashed there, it might have sunk deeper over time. But sonar scans revealed nothing. The sheriff called off the descent at midnight. When the teams climbed back up, they were drenched, exhausted, and empty-handed. The broken guardrail became a symbol of the case. News crews filmed it, reporters stood beside it, and locals drove out just to see the spot for themselves. Parents left flowers tied to the posts. But weeks later, it still offered no answers. The sheriff's office tested the splintered wood for paint transfer. There was none. It hadn't been hit by a vehicle. It had simply rotted and collapsed years before. Whatever had happened to the Blazer, it wasn't there. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the kids had run away to Nashville to start new lives. Others whispered darker theories: abduction, foul play. A few townspeople claimed to know about an old quarry near the Hollow Creek Ridge, filled decades ago after a collapse, deep enough to hide anything. A search team went there too, lowering sonar equipment into murky water. Again, nothing. By the end of the week, the official narrative unraveled. The sheriff faced the cameras and admitted what no one wanted to hear. There was no evidence, no scene, no explanation. Just 4 missing teenagers in a truck that had vanished without a trace. The case wasn't closed, but it had nowhere else to go. The townspeople refused to let it fade quietly. Candlelight vigils continued every Friday night outside Miller's Creek High. Flyers with smiling yearbook photos were taped to every gas pump, grocery store window, and church bulletin board. Even months later, when winter came and snow covered the hills, people still drove that back road looking for clues. But the forest stayed silent. In the sheriff's office, the file grew thicker. Hundreds of tips, maps, and statements. And yet, as the first anniversary approached, not a single piece of physical evidence had surfaced. The search that began with helicopters and hope ended with unanswered questions and 4 empty chairs at graduation. Still, one image stayed with everyone: the broken guardrail at mile marker 11. Deputies would drive past it sometimes and slow down without meaning to. They'd look out over the ravine and wonder if maybe they'd missed something small enough to hide in plain sight. Years later, one of them would admit that he couldn't stop thinking about that swampy bog below. He said the earth out there felt different, like it was holding on to something it didn't want to give up. At the time, no one listened. But 13 years later, when a farmer's tractor struck metal not far from that very ravine, every memory of that week came rushing back. As winter settled over Miller's Creek, the story of the 4 missing teenagers began to stretch thin between the lines of what people knew and what they needed to believe. The flyers were still taped to the diner windows, but their edges had curled from rain and time. The faces, Evan, Josh, Mia, Claire, looked younger now, as if the world had aged around them. Hope hadn't died all at once. It eroded slowly, like everything else in the hills. By spring of 1994, the official search had dwindled to a few exhausted deputies driving the same dirt roads they'd mapped out months earlier. Every tip led to the same silence. Sheriff Harold Crane, now promoted to lead investigator, carried the case file everywhere he went. His wife said he even kept it on the kitchen table during breakfast, flipping through maps and reports as if one detail might have changed overnight. He told her he couldn't let it go. Not when 4 families still had empty chairs at their dinner tables. The first real theories began to take hold. The most common one was simple, almost believable. The Blazer had crashed somewhere deep in the woods, maybe off an old mining trail, and disappeared into one of the sinkholes or flooded pits scattered through the region. Searchers had found dozens of them during the first week, dark mouths in the ground that seemed to breathe cold air. It wasn't impossible to think the truck had gone over an edge no one had ever found. But without debris, tire marks, or oil traces, there was nothing to prove it. Then came the darker speculation. A rumor started at a truck stop 2 counties over. Someone claimed to have seen 4 teenagers hitchhiking along Highway 41 that night. Another driver swore he'd picked up a boy, matching Josh's description, near the state line. But the story changed every time he told it. The sheriff followed every lead until they all dissolved into hearsay. The case file grew thicker, but not heavier, just emptier. By late 1995, locals had given the story its own name, the Miller's Creek 4. It was whispered at diners, told to newcomers who didn't yet know to lower their voices. People claimed to know more than they did about feuds, hidden parties, or strangers passing through town that week. Others talked about the mines. Decades earlier, the county had closed dozens of coal tunnels after floods and gas leaks. Some weren't even on record anymore. Miners said there were roads up there that didn't appear on any survey, roads you could take for miles and never find your way back. Detective Crane latched onto that idea. He spent months at the courthouse reviewing hand-drawn mining maps from the 1950s, comparing them against modern satellite images. Eventually, he found something. A decommissioned access road branching off Hollow Creek, not listed on any official document. It was long overgrown, hidden under brush, but faintly visible from the air. He organized a small team to investigate. They made it halfway up the ridge before the weather turned. It was April, and rain hit the region hard, washing out trails and flooding the hollows. Crane called it off after a deputy's truck nearly slid off the embankment. The road was closed again that same year, buried under landslides. The team never returned. Crane marked the spot on his map with a red X and promised himself he'd come back when the ground dried. He never did. Time kept moving, even though the case didn't. By 1997, Miller's Creek had changed. A new sheriff took over. The media stopped calling. Families tried to rebuild what was left. Mia's mother kept her daughter's room exactly as it had been. The trophies, the posters, the perfume bottles still lined up on the dresser. She vacuumed once a week, not because it needed it, but because it felt like proof that the room was still part of the house. Evan's father didn't last as long. He'd spent 2 winters walking the ridge, leaving food and flashlights at random campsites. He died of a heart attack in 1998, and people said grief had worn his heart down before the cold ever could. By the early 2000s, the town's children had grown up hearing the story as a cautionary tale. Don't drive Devil's Bend after dark. Don't take shortcuts you don't understand. The forest had become part of the legend, a place that swallowed mistakes and never apologized. The sheriff's department received the occasional tip. Always from out of town, always wrong. One woman mailed in a blurry photo she claimed showed a blue truck deep in the woods near her property. It turned out to be a rusted farm trailer. Another man confessed to knowing what happened, only to retract it the next day. The file went back into the cabinet, thicker than before, but no closer to an ending. Detective Crane retired in 2003, but he never really left the case. On quiet evenings, he'd drive out to Hollow Creek, park his car at the turnoff, and just listen. He said the silence out there was different, heavier. It made you feel like you were being watched. His notebooks from those years, found later among his belongings, are filled with sketches of roads, guesses at where the blazer could have gone, and short sentences scrawled in the margins. It has to be here somewhere. By the 10th anniversary, the Miller's Creek 4 was no longer an open case. It was folklore. People would point to the hills and tell newcomers about the night 4 kids vanished on a road that doesn't exist anymore. Some claimed they still saw flickering headlights out there after midnight, weaving through the trees before fading into the dark. But most had stopped looking for answers. They were just waiting for closure. Years later, that closure would finally come. Not from the woods or a search team, but from a farmer turning over soil on a forgotten patch of land, just a few miles from where Detective Crane had drawn his red X. It was a wet spring morning in April of 2006, when Howard Darnell first noticed something strange in his south pasture. He'd owned that land for more than 30 years. Flat farmland bordered by a shallow ridge and a narrow creek that overflowed every time it rained. The night before, a storm had rolled through, dumping nearly 3 inches of rain across Miller's Creek. By sunrise, the lower fields were soft, uneven, and streaked with water channels cutting through the mud. When Howard drove his tractor out to clear fallen brush, the rear tire suddenly sank deeper than it should have. He stepped out, boots sinking into the slop, and saw a depression in the ground about the size of a car hood, where the earth seemed to give way beneath him. He cursed under his breath, thinking it was an old drainage problem he'd meant to fix years earlier. He grabbed a shovel from the trailer, digging around the tire to loosen it, when the blade struck something hard and hollow. At first, he figured it was another chunk of rusted farm equipment. The property had once been leased to a mining company back in the 70s. Old scrap metal wasn't uncommon. But when he cleared a few inches of mud, he saw something smooth beneath the rust, a curve of metal that caught a faint glint of blue under the morning light. He crouched, wiped the dirt away with his sleeve, and felt his chest tighten. The shape wasn't random. It was contoured, familiar. A hood. Howard called the sheriff's office that afternoon, telling them he thought he'd found a car under the field. By the time deputies arrived, rain was beginning again. They examined the site, marking off the soft earth with stakes. The next morning, the county recovery team came with pumps and backhoes. As they drained the standing water, the outline of the vehicle slowly emerged, buried nose first in the sediment. The roof nearly caved in, the rear bumper sticking out just enough to catch the eye. When the mud was finally cleared away, one of the deputies stepped closer and read what little was left of the badge on the tailgate. Chevrolet. The blue paint beneath the rust was unmistakable. It was the Blazer. News spread through Miller's Creek in hours. People who hadn't said the names Evan, Josh, Mia, or Claire in years found themselves whispering them again. The case everyone thought had been swallowed by the earth had maybe really been swallowed. Now it was giving something back. The recovery took 2 full days. The vehicle was pulled from the mud with care, a crane lifting it inch by inch until it rested on solid ground. The Blazer was almost entirely intact, despite the years underground. The windshield had collapsed inward. The frame bent like it had taken a slow, crushing fall. When investigators opened the doors, the smell of wet earth and metal filled the air. Inside, they found what they'd feared for 13 years. 4 skeletal remains. Each was still belted in. Bits of clothing clung to the bones. Decayed fabric in faded colors that matched what the teenagers had been wearing the night they disappeared. There was a scrap of denim, a fragment of red flannel, the silver clasp of a hair barrette. The dashboard was folded inward from pressure, and the steering wheel had snapped at the center. But there were details that didn't fit the picture of a crash. The gear shift was in neutral. The parking brake was off, and though the wiring had long corroded, the switch for the headlights was still turned on. Investigators stood in silence. Sheriff Crane, now long retired, came out to the site after hearing the news. He watched from the fence line, hands trembling as he looked down at what had haunted him for over a decade. He said later that something about the position of the vehicle bothered him. It wasn't buried by an impact. It looked placed there, as if it had been rolled down slowly and swallowed over time by the rain and sediment. The location deepened the mystery. The field where the Blazer was found was barely 2 miles from the search area marked off back in 1993. The ravine with the broken guardrail, the one everyone had assumed led nowhere, sat just across the creek from where Howard's pasture began. Somehow, no one had ever thought to dig there. Over the years, rain and soil runoff had layered over the sinkhole until the ground appeared level again. Forensics teams began the delicate work of documenting everything. They removed the remains carefully, sealing each set of bones in separate evidence bags for later identification. Among the debris inside the Blazer were small, chilling details. A rusted keychain shaped like a football helmet, a melted cassette tape with the label smudged away, and a wristwatch stopped at 10:47 in the evening. When the bones were sent for examination, investigators confirmed what the town had feared but somehow expected. The remains belonged to Evan Blake, Josh Carnes, Mia Dalton, and Claire Rivers, the Miller's Creek 4. The discovery that should have brought closure instead opened new questions. If it had been an accident, why was the gear shift in neutral? Why were the headlights turned on? And how did the truck end up in a pasture that wasn't even part of their intended route? Locals gathered near the property line as crews worked. Some brought flowers, others just stood watching in disbelief. For them, it felt like waking up from a nightmare that had never ended. For the parents who were still alive, it was grief reborn. 13 years of not knowing had kept a small flame of hope alive. Now that hope was gone, replaced by the heavy truth that their children hadn't survived that night. But also by the uneasy realization that something about their deaths didn't make sense. As the Blazer was loaded onto a flatbed to be taken to the county forensics lab, Sheriff Crane stayed until the last light faded. When asked what he thought really happened, he didn't answer right away. He looked at the hollowed-out pit where the truck had been and said quietly, "It's not where they went off the road that matters. It's who helped them get here." That single line reignited everything. Old suspicions, old guilt, and a new investigation that would finally reveal what had been buried with those 4 kids all those years ago. When the Blazer was finally towed from the field, the entire town of Miller's Creek held its breath. For 13 years, people had imagined what that truck might look like when it was found, if it was ever found. Some pictured a rusted skeleton swallowed by mud and time. Others imagined it crushed, empty, picked clean by the earth. But no one was prepared for what the forensic team actually uncovered once the mud was washed away. The recovery unit brought the vehicle to a secure facility just outside Lexington, where it sat under halogen lights, an unrecognizable shell of metal streaked with red clay and corrosion. The process took days. Technicians in white coveralls documented every inch, brushing sediment from crevices, photographing fragments, and labeling evidence with quiet precision. When the interior was cleaned, the first personal items began to emerge. A cracked cassette tape case, a rusted seatbelt buckle, a discolored sneaker with its sole half gone. Then came something small but unmistakable. Mia Dalton's silver heart-shaped locket, its hinge still intact. When they pried it open, faint initials were visible inside. FF, short for Forever Friends. It was the same phrase the 4 friends had carved into the bleachers their senior year. The engraving was enough to confirm what the DNA tests would later prove beyond any doubt. The remains belonged to Evan Blake, Josh Carnes, Mia Dalton, and Claire Rivers. Once the bones were removed and catalogued, the autopsies began. The initial findings were expected: extensive fractures consistent with the truck's crushing weight. But as the lead forensic examiner worked through the remains, inconsistencies started to surface. 3 of the skulls showed impact patterns that didn't align with a single crash trajectory. The fractures weren't from blunt force caused by metal or windshield glass. They were angled, irregular, and appeared to have occurred before the vehicle was buried. More alarming still, one of the victims, Josh Carnes, showed a distinct break in the hyoid bone, the small U-shaped bone in the neck that often fractures during strangulation. The examiner paused the report. The finding didn't fit with a simple rollover accident. It suggested something else: violence before death. Back at the site, investigators returned to the photographs of the vehicle. One detail stood out immediately. The Blazer's 4 tires were completely deflated, not shredded by age, but slashed, deep and deliberate. The cuts were too clean, the angles too precise to be caused by years underground. Forensic analysis confirmed the rubber had been sliced with a blade. All 4 tires. Detectives knew what that meant. The Blazer hadn't gone off the road on its own. It had been staged. The discovery shifted the case overnight from tragic accident to homicide. Files that had been boxed and archived since the mid-90s were reopened, dust brushed off the edges. Old evidence logs were retyped into digital form, Sheriff Crane, long retired but still sharp, came in to consult. He'd kept every note, every field report. It was in those pages that the team found something overlooked from the original investigation. A witness statement dated the 23rd of October, 1993, 2 days after the kids disappeared. The report came from a man named Ralph Denny, a truck driver who lived on the far side of Hollow Creek Road. He told deputies that on the night of the disappearance, just past 10:30 in the evening, he'd heard shouting, multiple voices, and the sound of an engine revving hard before it cut out abruptly. Denny had thought it might have been teenagers partying near the abandoned mine road. The deputies logged his account, but dismissed it when no tire tracks or debris were found nearby. His statement was buried in a supplemental file marked inconclusive. That old report, once ignored, now seemed impossible to overlook. Investigators pulled land records and property maps from the area near Hollow Creek. That's when another detail caught their attention. The tract of land adjacent to the old mining road had once belonged to Gary Blake, Evan's uncle. The connection wasn't new. His name appeared once in early witness logs, but at the time it hadn't raised suspicion. He'd been interviewed briefly in 1993, claiming he hadn't seen the teens that night and had been out of town on a contracting job. But what the records revealed now was that Gary sold that property less than a year after the disappearance. The sale was sudden and quiet. Within months, he'd relocated to Ohio, leaving no forwarding address. To most, it might have been coincidence. To the detectives who'd just seen proof of slashed tires and possible homicide, it was anything but. A judge granted a search warrant for the land, now owned by a timber company, and a small team was dispatched to investigate. Deep in the woods, behind what used to be a locked access gate, they found remnants of a long-forgotten structure. A narrow maintenance shed built from corrugated metal and pine boards, half collapsed under years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and dust. Old paint cans, rope, and mechanical parts littered the floor. But near the far wall, under a collapsed shelf, something caught the light. Small, jagged strips of black rubber, half embedded in the dirt. Forensics collected them. Later testing confirmed the fragments were tire rubber cut by a blade. Just outside the shed, near the tree line, another discovery sealed the suspicion. Beneath a thin layer of leaves and soil lay a section of a vehicle grille. It was twisted, rusted, and nearly unrecognizable, but the metal pattern matched that of a 1989 Chevrolet Blazer. Investigators stared at the piece, silent. After 13 years, the land had finally given up more than bones. It had started to give up the truth. The evidence was circumstantial, but the connections were impossible to ignore. Gary Blake's land bordered the area where the teens were last believed to have driven. The slashed tires suggested deliberate sabotage. The autopsy pointed to violence before the crash, and the gear shift left in neutral indicated someone had rolled the Blazer into the pit, headlights still on, perhaps hoping it would sink deep enough to vanish forever. For the families, the new revelations were a brutal resurrection. For years, they had accepted the story of an accident, of kids taking a wrong turn on a dangerous night. Now, that fragile peace was gone. The truth emerging from the mud was far darker, one that suggested someone who knew them, someone they trusted, might have been responsible. The county coroner released the findings to the public in late May of 2006. The words hit like a shockwave. Homicide investigation reopened. Reporters returned. Television trucks parked outside the sheriff's office. People who hadn't spoken about the case in years began remembering things. Old arguments, family tensions, strange visits, unexplained repairs. Rumors spread faster than evidence could catch up. But behind the noise, one fact remained. The last road the teens were seen driving toward, Hollow Creek Mine Road, cut straight past the property Gary Blake once owned. And just beyond that property, hidden for over a decade, was the pit that had swallowed their truck. For detectives, the circle had finally begun to close. And as they built their timeline, connecting the broken bones, the cut rubber, and the forgotten shed, they knew one thing for certain. Whoever put those kids in that truck didn't just want to hide them. They wanted to erase them. But they'd failed. Because, in 2006, with the mud finally drained and the evidence out in daylight, the truth had started to surface. And it was pointing straight back to someone who had been part of their family all along. If this case has captured your attention, please consider subscribing to Crime Records. Hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these important stories. By late summer of 2006, the investigation that had once defined Miller's Creek's worst tragedy was suddenly alive again. The discovery of the blazer, the forensics, the tire evidence, it had all reopened wounds the town thought had healed. But now, detectives had a name, a link, and a reason to believe the truth had been there all along. Gary Blake, Evan's uncle, was living in a modest home outside Columbus, Ohio. He'd been gone from Kentucky for nearly 12 years, remarried, working quiet jobs under his own name. To the outside world, he was just another man who'd left small-town life behind. But to investigators, he was the final piece of a puzzle that had haunted them for over a decade. Two detectives from the Kentucky State Police drove north to interview him. What started as a courtesy visit quickly turned into something more. Gary looked older than they remembered from the photos in the original file, his hair grayed, his hands trembling slightly as he poured coffee. At first, he denied everything, claiming he'd left Kentucky long before the disappearance. But when the investigators placed the photographs on the table, the rusted blazer, the shed on his former property, the slashed tire fragments found beneath the dirt, something in him changed. His eyes stayed fixed on the images for a long time. Then he set his cup down, folded his hands, and said quietly, "That night wasn't supposed to go that way." The confession came slowly, pieced together in fragments. Back in October of 1993, Gary had been drinking heavily. His property bordered the old Hollow Creek Mine Road, and he often complained that kids from town used it as a shortcut to get to the main highway. He'd had tools stolen before, floodlights, gas cans, even a generator, and he'd become paranoid about trespassers. That night, when he saw headlights bouncing along the ridge near his storage shed, he grabbed a flashlight and a wrench and went to confront whoever was out there. It was Evan's truck, his own nephew behind the wheel. The four teenagers had decided to take the shortcut through his land, just like others had done before. Gary said he yelled for them to leave, but they laughed, thought it was a joke. The argument escalated fast. Words turned to shoving. One of the boys, he couldn't remember who, grabbed his arm, and in the chaos, Gary swung the wrench. He said he hadn't meant to hit anyone, but when the sound echoed through the trees, everything went still. Evan fell, blood at his temple. The others panicked. Mia screamed. Josh tried to run toward the truck, but Gary blocked him. He remembered shouting, trying to calm them down, telling them it was an accident. But in his drunken haze, the panic grew until it became something else, something colder. He realized what would happen if anyone found out. His record, the drinking, the temper. It would all come out. He claimed that what he did next was pure fear. He loaded the unconscious teens into the blazer, one by one. Evan in the front seat, the others in the back. He didn't check their pulses. He didn't want to. The storm was starting, the wind carrying mist off the ridge, and in that moment he made a decision that would bury 4 lives and his own for the next 13 years. He drove the Blazer down to the lowest part of his property, near the old flooded pit left over from mining runoff. He said he thought it would look like a crash site, that maybe the rain and mud would cover the evidence. Before he rolled the truck forward, he reached inside with a pocket knife and slashed each tire. Front, back, all 4. He shifted the truck into neutral, turned the headlights on, and let it go. The Blazer slid into the muck slowly, almost silently, until only the glow of the lights was visible above the waterline. Then those too disappeared. Gary sat on the ridge for hours after, drinking from a half-empty bottle until the rain washed most of the mud away from his hands. By dawn, he'd convinced himself it would all vanish with the storm. A week later, when the search began, he told anyone who asked that he hadn't been home that night. He even helped pass out flyers, just like everyone else. 13 years later, he was sitting in an interrogation room with his head in his hands. When detectives asked him why he never came forward, he didn't have an answer beyond, "I thought it was done. I thought it was buried." It was the kind of closure no one wanted, but it was closure all the same. The answers had come too late for forgiveness, too late to fill the years lost to silence. But for the first time since 1993, there were names on the graves instead of question marks, and the story that had haunted Miller's Creek could finally be told in full. In the end, the case became more than a tragedy. It became a warning about the dangers of anger left unchecked, about how fear can twist a moment of panic into something irreversible, and about how one shortcut taken on a familiar road can lead somewhere you can never come back from. Even now, locals say the fields near Hollow Creek feel different after dark. There are no strange lights, no ghost stories, just the uneasy stillness of a place that remembers. The same woods that hid the truth for 13 years now stand silent, watching over the spot where 4 young lives ended and one man's guilt began. And for Miller's Creek, the mystery that had defined a generation finally had an answer, one that would echo through the town long after the mud dried and the headlights faded. Thank you for watching this episode of Crime Records. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you these important stories. Until next time, stay safe. Gary Blake was arrested and charged with 4 counts of manslaughter and obstruction of justice. His confession matched the forensic evidence almost exactly. The broken skulls, the slashed tires, the neutral gear shift, the headlights left on. The town that had once mourned an accident now had to face a far uglier truth. The person responsible hadn't been a stranger or some drifter passing through. It had been family. When the case finally went to court later that year, few people from Miller's Creek could bear to attend. The families had waited too long, carried too much. Some wanted justice, others only wanted silence. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before delivering the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Gary was sentenced to 25 years in state prison. He would be eligible for parole at 74. The day the verdict was read, a small crowd gathered near the field where the Blazer had been pulled from the mud months earlier. There were no reporters this time, no cameras, just the families, a handful of deputies, and Sheriff Crane standing at the edge of the property he'd walked 100 times before. Crews were finishing the final recovery, removing what was left of the vehicle. The families had been allowed to visit once more before it was taken for storage. No one spoke for a long time. The wind rustled through the grass, and the faint hum of machinery carried across the field. Crane, now older, slower, and long retired, looked out over the landscape that had held its secret for so long. The woods kept their secret, he said quietly, until they were ready to give it back.